Oh, hello boys and girls. Nice to see you back again. So we're going to read chapter 2 now of Mr Mousey's adventure, Mr Mousey Beyond the Silver Sea, the first book in the series. Well, if you remember, whenever we finished last time, Mr Rabbit had brought his friend Mr Mousey a parcel that he'd got, but he hadn't opened it, and he wasn't quite brave enough, and he got Mr Mousey to open it, and what do you know, whenever it was opened, it turned out to be a book. That's as far as we got. So we're going to continue now. If you're all seated nice and comfortably and ready, then I will read chapter 2. Chapter 2, the book. "Did you say a book?" asked the voice from beneath the sofa. "Yes, but look, what a book," replied the little mouse. "I've never seen a book like this before." Now, Mr Rabbit had more or less persuaded himself that life might actually be going to last at least a little bit longer than he had been expecting, and he managed to undo himself from beneath the sofa. "Now, who would send me a book like that?" he asked, crossing the room and warily studying the book in much the same way as you might approach an apparently dead tiger which only moments early had been chasing you around a jungle. Now, that may not be a comparison you or I have personally experienced, and I have to admit I know I certainly haven't, but if you have, and that actual tiger had suddenly and mysteriously dropped down dead in the almost completed act of trying to make you as dead as it now would seem to be, well, how convinced would you be? So Mr Rabbit wasn't too sure. Mr Rabbit was now back to his previous position of peering over his friend's shoulder, the size of which he felt was alarmingly small for safely peering over. The reason he had remarked a book like that lay before the two creatures on the table. The book, put simply, was splendid. Put slightly less simply, it was a wonderfully ornate and decorated volume, all gilt and deeply coloured. Put least simply of all, what lay on the table was a book the likes of which had never been seen before, certainly not by the mouse and the rabbit, and probably not by anyone else either. The overall colour scheme of the cover was a deep vermilion red. The sort of red you get when you mix some black into your red in your paint box and you sort of overdo it a bit. The dark red of the cover was offset by the brightness of the brass corners. On each corner of the book were brass wedges, each one inscribed with curious patterns. Swirls and strange letters covered all the brazen surfaces and lent even greater mystery to what was, to be quite frank, just about as mysterious gets. Patterns covered not only the corners, but the cover as well. Raised letters of a language unknown to the little creatures sat up on the cover and were antique gold in colour, and the spine of the book bore more of the same type of writing. Holding the book firmly shut was a clasp which showed no place for a key, but instead had a solid boss or a stud in the clasp at the front. I think you just push this button to open it, grunted Mr Mousey as he pushed soundly, then very firmly, then with all of his might on the stud. Nothing happened. "Nothing happened," said Mr Rabbit. "Maybe you didn't push hard enough." "Here, you have a go," said Mr Mousey, moving aside. "I can't," replied the rabbit. I can't get close enough." "You can't get close enough?" "No, I think my legs would like to take the rest of me to a thoroughly safer place, and my head agrees." Mr Mousey wrinkled his brow and looked sideways at his chum. "Well, Maybe if you closed your eyes and pushed the button, he suggested. Mr. Rabbit seemed to consider this for a moment, nodded in a kind of, well, I suppose, sort of way, and pushed the button, with his eyes closed, of course. Nothing. Not even a peep. Not even a squeak. Mr. Mousey stuck out his bottom lip and rubbed his nose. Maybe it's not a pushing kind of a button. Here, can I try again? Be my guest. As Mr. Rabbit took up what he hoped was a safe distance, Mr. Mousey tried turning the stud on the clasp. It didn't seem to be designed to turn either. Not a turning type of button either then. Sliding perhaps, muttered Mr. Mousey. It seemed to make no difference though. Turning, sliding, twisting, nothing could get the clasp to unbuckle. Meanwhile, most of Mr. Rabbit's fear had faded away, and he was himself getting into the idea that an open book was preferable to one that stubbornly refused to show itself. Pull up a chair and we'll give this a bit more thought, said Mr. Mousey. You haven't tried that yet, suggested Mr. Rabbit. What? Pulling up a chair? I'm not too sure that would open it, to be honest, replied Mr. Mousey. No, I mean pulling. Pull the button. Oh yes, of course. How silly of me. I haven't tried pulling right enough. Mr. Mousey leant over the book again with Mr. Rabbit beside him, now curious enough to risk leaving the protection of his friend's shoulder. As easy as a well-used switch, the stud pulled back with a clear click, and the clasp, as though on a slow motion spring, slowly and purposefully swung open. Mr. Mousey and Mr. Rabbit looked at one another and then turned and looked at the book. The cover slowly swung back to reveal the ivory-coloured pages within. The first page gazed back at them as they both gaped with eyes like dinner plates at the revealed page. It was the list of contents. They knew because that's what it said. In very large gold letters, written in flowing capital letters, it said, List of Contents. Below that was a very short list. In fact, a list of one. It just said, Chapter 1, The Arrival of the Book. After that, the chapters were all numbered, but from chapter 2 all the way to chapter 18, none of them was titled, though it was as if there was space beside each of the numbers for something to be written in. That's odd, remarked Mr. Mousey. It doesn't have a very finished look about it. The artwork is fabulous though, isn't it? Mr. Rabbit nodded his head silently in agreement. Fabulous was exactly the right word for it. The page was a rage of colour and design. Intricate script covered the borders of the page and lines, all intertwining, changing colour and shape as the page and lines crossed. The capital L for list of contents wandered all over the page as if it didn't know what it was supposed to be doing. Here and there were illustrations like the ones on the stamps of the packaging, but even smaller. Unlike the drawings on the packing, these were richly coloured and the lines seemed to be drawn in gold. Open it up and see if there's any more pictures, said Mr. Rabbit, who wasn't too interested in writing. This is because he wasn't actually a very good reader. Well, actually he was not able to read at all apart from his name and a few other things that interested him. Words like food and free, well, he knew them quite well, and although it seemed to him he didn't see enough of those words quite often enough. Anyway, the mouse turned over the page, and as he did, yet another surprise awaited them. The right-hand page was all writing, but the left was entirely taken up with an illustration, with a picture. It was what the illustration was, what it was of, that was the most surprising thing. It showed two animals, a mouse and a rabbit, leaning over a table, peering at a large book laid out before them. What were they peering at? It was a drawing in the book. A tiny drawing of a tiny mouse and a tiny rabbit peering at an even tinier book. And if you looked even closer and squinted, it was possible to make out the book in the drawing. It was the same scene again. That's us! It's us! You and me! Looking at us! Us! And the book! Cried Mr Rabbit. He stepped back, tripped on the fireside rug, and plopped down flat on his bottom. He was so shocked at the picture, he didn't even realise he had fallen. We're in the book, looking at the book. It's us in the book, looking at the book. Mr Mousey, meanwhile, though every bit as amazed as his friend, still had the coolness of mind to continue reading the page. His eyes moved over and he began to read the writing. It all began, he read aloud, when the mouse and the rabbit opened the book. See, it is us. How come we're in a book? Interrupted Mr Rabbit. Mr Mousey turned and looked at his pal. Exciting or what, eh? He asked. He looked at the rabbit in his unusual position on the floor. Why are you sitting on the floor? Mr Rabbit looked around and then looked up at Mr Mousey. Oh, I don't know. But isn't this all a bit weird? How can there be a story of us doing what we're doing in a book as we're doing it? There's more, replied Mr Mousey without answering Mr Rabbit's question. Not that he was being ignorant or anything. Like the rabbit, he was amazed and couldn't understand it either. He continued reading. In the book, they found, among other things, the way to the adventure ahead, the mission of rescue, the map of the journey, and the warnings of danger. Oh, great, sighed Mr Rabbit. First dragons, and now danger. Listen to this, Mr Mousey continued. Of all the hope in the world, it seemed the only hope lay in the courage of the mouse and the bravery of the rabbit. Oh, bravery? Does it say anything more about me? Asked Mr Rabbit, getting to his feet and wondering if perhaps this wasn't such a bad book after all. Mr Mousey read on. The first stage lay across the river to find the old oak where they would find what they needed to begin the journey. What would they find? Don't stop now, Mr Mousey. What would they find? The rabbit was getting more and more interested by the second. Why, he had always fancied being famous, and here he was in a book that was all about him. Well, him and Mr Mousey. He wanted to hear more. Mr Mousey turned the page. That's funny, he said. Oh, it's a funny book. Are there jokes now? Said Mr Rabbit, clapping his paws. Go on, read a joke. No, I mean funny, strange. There are no more words. Sure enough, the next 2 pages had no words at all, apart from the 2 words Chapter 2 above the otherwise blank right-hand page. The left-hand page, like the first, was filled in though, but with another picture. Mr Mousey put his tiny thumb in here as a bookmark and flicked quickly through the rest of the book. The pages were all of a very thick material, probably parchment, thought Mr Mousey, who knew about all sorts of things. But apart from chapter headings, there were no more words, just pictures on the left-hand pages. "Aww," sighed Mr Rabbit, "just as I was getting interested." Mr Mousey had turned back to the picture on chapter 2 and was studying it intently. "Look at this," he said. "It's us. Well, the rabbit and the mouse looking into a tree." The two friends examined this next picture. In a very wind-swept landscape with low gorse and thorn bushes, an old tree was straining under the force of a gale. Near to the tree, a small stream wandered by, its path deeply cut into the stony ground. At the foot of the tree, the mouse and the rabbit were head to head, looking into a hollow just above the roots. A low hill lay on the background. "I seem to be very bravely looking at something," said Mr Rabbit. "Don't you think I'm especially brave looking in that picture?" Well, to be honest, since all you could see of either animal was the back of their heads and their backsides, it was hard to agree to this, but Mr Mousey very graciously did so anyway. "Yes, indeed, very brave indeed, and you are right, though it does seem to be us, without doubt." Mr Mousey liked to be sure about something before he quoted it as a fact, but in this picture, even though their faces could not be seen, was the absolute proof. It was a scarf. It was a lovely cosy red scarf, and Mr Mousey liked it very much. Auntie Mabel was a bit colourblind, and when she had been knitting it, she had run out of the red wool she had been using. Rummaging through her wool box, she had been delighted to find one last ball of wool to finish off the present. Being colourblind, she utterly failed to notice that it was green. Mr Mousey never let on when he had opened the parcel all those months and years before. Besides, the 4 inches of green at one end meant that no one else was going to have one exactly the same. Now, in the picture, wrapped around the neck of the little mouse was the exact same scarf. Now, what can we be looking at? Where are we? And how did we get there? Thought Mr Mousey aloud. "Does it say anything about tea time?" put in Mr Rabbit, who had been suddenly spoken to by his stomach. It was saying things like, "Feed me," and "Food, now." Mr Rabbit had a very demanding stomach. Mr Mousey looked at the book and then back at the rabbit. "Yes, you are quite right. Time to take a break from the book and do something different, at least to give us time to consider what exactly we've got here." The mouse closed the book and headed off into the kitchen. He was quickly joined by Mr Rabbit, and together the two of them began to cook up a jolly nice tea. It wasn't too long until the potatoes were bubbling away on the stove and the kitchen was a blur of two very busy animals. Mr Rabbit was chopping up the onions and scallions when a knock came to the door. Mr Mousey, who was now setting the table, answered the door to find Billy Badger standing on the step. "Oh, hello, Billy. Oh, why don't you come on in? We're just about to have some champ, and there's plenty enough for 3. Come on in and take a seat." Well, I hadn't realised you had visitors. Sure, I'll call again. Mr Mousey cut him short. "Not at all. Don't be silly. Of course, come on in. Besides, it's only Mr Rabbit." "Oi, less of the only bit," came Mr Rabbit's voice from the kitchen. Billy looked somewhat flustered, but Mr Mousey had no intention of taking no for an answer, so before Billy could argue any more about it, Mr Mousey had him in the room and the door shut behind him. "Now, when did you ever hear such nonsense as visiting someone only to leave when they answer the door?" said the little mouse as he seated Billy down onto one of the fireside seats. Now, I really must point out something that may have already caused some confusion in this story. You see, normal animals that might live near you are different in some respects from Mr Mousey, Mr Rabbit, Owl, Sammy Squirrel, Billy Badger and all the other creatures of the woods. I mean, apart from the obvious fact that they don't make cups of tea or wear scarves, but in the case of normal woodland animals, a mouse is an awful lot smaller than a badger or even a rabbit, come to that. But in these woods, in the woods, however, the difference in sizes isn't so great. Mr Mousey was, of course, smaller than Mr Rabbit, and he in turn than Billy Badger, but not by so much. In size, Mr Mousey was almost 2 or 3 times the size of mice that normally try to get into your house every winter, and Mr Rabbit about the size of a large kitten. Billy, where badgers in the wild can be the size of a medium-sized dog, would be comparable to the size of an ordinary rabbit. Now why this should be, I don't really know. Maybe intelligence kind of, I don't know, evens things up a bit, or maybe it was just the special magic of the woods, for the woods was indeed a very magical place. Maybe all that had something to do with growth. Whatever the reason, the result was that Billy Badger, even though bigger than Mr Mousey, could still visit him in his home and sit in one of his chairs by the fire, which was where we left him. Mr Mousey added another setting to the table and poured an extra glass of milk. Mr Rabbit walked in with a pot of steaming champ and set it down quickly on the table. "Ow, ow, ow, Bernie, Bernie! Oh, hello, Mr. Hello, Billy, hello," said Mr Rabbit in between blowing on his paws. "Mr Mousey should open a restaurant. We eat here so often," he laughed. This was true, of course, because Mr Mousey quite often found himself being his host for his friends. He didn't mind at all, and they were very happy to oblige him. Yeah, well, I didn't mean to push in and shh, said Mr Mousey. "Would you like some butter?" "Well, since you ask, yes, please," answered Billy. "Thank you very much." They all bowed their heads as Mr Mousey gave thanks. No one would ever dream of tucking in without first saying grace in the woods. "We're not ignorant pigs," Mr Rabbit would say if anyone suggested otherwise. Whether or not pigs give thanks, I don't know, but they are messy eaters right enough. As they ate, Mr Mousey turned to the badger. "So what brings you round tonight?" "I actually came round to see if you knew about Mr Rabbit," said Billy, peering over his plate. "Of course he knows about me," interrupted Mr Rabbit. "Here I am, look, handsome and brave as ever." "Why, what has he been up to now?" smiled the mouse with a glint in his eye. "Testing some more of your lettuce and forgetting to ask again?" Mr Rabbit looked quickly at his plate and suddenly became interested in the patterns on the rim. "Lettuce?" asked Billy. "No, I meant... Well, actually, I meant Mr Rabbit's parcel." "How did you know about my parcel?" asked Mr Rabbit, looking surprised. "Billy Badger is the postman," said Mr Mousey. "And as he delivered your parcel this morning, I think that would give him a fair idea." "Yes, that's right. Yes, of course, I am just a bit fuddled after all of our excitement." Billy Badger looked expectantly at the other two. Not that I'm being nosy or anything," he began to explain, "but with all those funny stamps and all, well, it it did seem to be a very important sort of a parcel, and well, it's hard not to be..." "Nosy," put in Mr Rabbit. "May as well just admit it. Of course you're nosy. Why else would you want to be the postman? Billy opened his eyes wide and tried his hardest to look innocent and blameless of any such accusation, but found it hard. After all, he was tremendously interested in Mr. Rabbit's parcel. He had hardly been able to think of anything else all day. "Well, it's hardly a secret anyway, is it?" said Mr. Mousey. "Why don't we tell him?" "It's a book," said Mr. Rabbit, who was actually very glad that someone had asked him about his parcel. He could feel a sense of his own importance growing all the time. After all, he was the brave Mr. Rabbit, and naturally people would be interested in him. In point of fact, it had been the parcel that Billy was interested in, but he hoped for more than just a book. "Only a book?" he asked, curling up his lip in a kind of "is that all" kind of way. "Only a book? Only a book all about me is what? That's what? Hardly only a book," cried Mr. Rabbit, pointing first at himself, then at the book lying closed on the table, then at himself again, in case Billy had missed it the first time. "Would you like to see it?" asked Mr. Mousey, who pushed aside his plate and made his way around the table to the book. Billy nodded. Since he had just placed another forkful of champ in his mouth, he didn't speak. "It's full of pictures of me," mumbled Mr. Rabbit, whose mouth was filled with champ. So it was more like this. "It's full of pictures of me." More like that. Because his mouth was filled with champ, and whose table manners were not such a high standard. Soon the three friends were flicking through the book, looking at the pictures, and Mr. Badger found that indeed this was no ordinary book. "Whoa," he said eventually, which was quite a remark for Billy. "But what are you going to do about it?" They had been looking at the picture of the old oak tree, and now Mr. Mousey stood upright and proclaimed in a steady voice, "We head off tomorrow, across the river, and adventures beyond." Mr. Rabbit sprang up, his eyes wide and white. "Across the river? You must be joking!" And that's the end of chapter 2. If you want to hear the next chapter, which is called The Beginning, well, you'll have to click on to the next chapter on YouTube. Hope you enjoyed that. This book sounds very interesting. Where is it going? Why are they in it? And why do the words only appear as they read it? We'll need to find out in the next chapter.